Good evening. Oh, I like that. I'm Ann Knigendorf. I'm a writer and editor here at the Kansas City Public Library, and I'm also a Navy veteran. So welcome to all my fellow veterans. Thank you for being here tonight, and a special thanks to our friends at the U.S. Command and General Staff College, particularly Chris Johnson. Will you raise your hand, Chris? Where are you? There he is in the back. He and my colleague Steve Weber coordinate these events, and we really appreciate it. Before we get started with the program, I'd like to call out two other military-related programs we have coming up. One is August 8th. It's part of our series, our other series, with the Command and General Staff College called Conflict and Crisis. Brian Steed will lead a panel talking about Iran. That's August 8th, and we'll be at the Central Library location. And at the end of August, August 31st, I'll be up here on the stage talking to Beth Bailey. She's a professor at KU, and she has written a book called An Army of Fire, How the U.S. Army Confronted Its Racial Crisis in the Vietnam Era. She came highly recommended by our friends at the CGSC, so we booked her. And also, who knows about our FYI book club series? A few of you. So that's something we do at the Kansas City Star. And I'll mention it tonight because the book that we're talking about this summer on August 15th at the Linda Hall Library and August 20th at the World War I Museum is called The Facemaker by Lindsay Fitzharris. And if you're interested in World War I, as I'm going to assume you are, at least a little bit, that one is all about how trench warfare and advances in weaponry ended up causing incredible advances in reconstructive surgery, in plastic surgery during World War I. So it's a fascinating book, and if you're interested in participating, the FYI Book Club is for absolutely anyone to participate in, and contact the library for more information. So tonight, we have Shawn Faulkner here to talk about 1918, the challenge of attritional war. And this is part of our Turning Point series. I think this is Dr. Faulkner's third time speaking at the Kansas City Public Library, and we're so glad to have him back. He's a professor of military history at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College. He served in the Army for 23 years as an armor officer, commanding a tank company during Operation Desert Storm before retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He's also taught American history at West Point. He's the author of 3 books, including Pershing's Crusaders, The American Soldier in World War I, which earned the Richard W. Leopold Prize from the Organization of American Historians as the best book on foreign policy, military affairs, historical activities of federal government, documentary histories, or biography written by a U.S. government historian or federal contract historian. Please welcome Shawn Faulkner.
Well, it is my absolute pleasure to be here tonight. Now, when I saw the number of folks in the audience, I turned to my wife. My wife came with me begrudgingly. She's been to too many of these. And I said, "Look at the crowd." And she said, "Yeah, it's amazing what people will do for free wine." And I figure with all the rain going on, you couldn't go home and mow your lawn either. So, we'll work with that. Now, this is part of the Department of Military History at CGSC and KC Public Library's themed presentation. So this year's theme has been Turning Points in War. And tonight I'm going to talk about the turning point of World War I. Now, I got to be honest with you, though. This is a historian being honest. Be very careful. Come on, historians deal with hindsight. And this whole idea of turning points in war is a historian's trick. Sitting as Monday morning quarterbacks long after the event, trying to add order to something that at the time for the participants was inherently clouded and chaotic. Okay? To paraphrase Napoleon, history is a mutually agreed upon lie. Okay? Now, that being said, there is something worth thinking about when we talk about these turning points in war. At what point in time does it become evident that one side is on the path to defeat and the other side is on the path to victory? Now, World War I is sort of special because it is a large attritional total war. So trying to figure out a turning point in the midst of an attritional total war, I think becomes a little bit more difficult. Now, if we look at what's going on in the Ukraine, another large attritional war, it's good to remind ourselves what attritional war is all about. First of all, total wars almost always turn into attritional war because of the stakes. If you're going to ask members of your society to constantly give up their blood, sweat, treasure, and toil, they've got to be doing that for some deep cause. And so these wars tend to be existential in the minds of the combatant, to get them to sacrifice. So everybody on both sides now is throwing in everything they possibly can. And we talk about attrition. It's occurring simultaneously on both sides, but it's also occurring at different levels. So on the military side, at the tactical and the operational level, when we talk about attrition, generally we're talking about the attrition of manpower and materiel, an enemy's ability to wage war. But perhaps most important is also the other aspect, the national strategic degree of attrition. And at that level, what's being attrited is the popular and the political and even the economic will to continue the fight. Now, this would have been no surprise to the World War I generation. We have two key players here who are already identifying what it means to fight this type of war. On one hand, you've got Georges Clemenceau, who will lead France as the premier in the last 2 years of the war. Now, his nickname is Le Tigre, the tiger, and it's not because he's a nice little guy, a little pussycat. In fact, going into 1917, when he's asked what is his goal for his new government, he says, my foreign policy is I make war. My domestic policy, I make war. All the time, I make war. Now, just in case you missed the subtlety, Clemenceau makes war. And when it comes to this aspect of the attritional war that he's in, he goes back to that aspect of national will. At the end of the day, just as we're seeing playing out in the Ukraine today, oftentimes at the national level, all the way from the lowest civilian to the lowest private, all the way to the highest general and the highest politician, they have to believe in their hearts that they can hold on just 15 minutes longer than the other guy to secure victory. But the other guy up here is Hans Delbrück. He is one of the greatest military historians in modern history. He's also a military commentator. And look at this. 9 years before World War I breaks out, he gives everybody the warning. He said the next great war between major powers is going to be ugly and attritional. And in these type of wars, the ultimate victor is going to be that can retain the last dollar in their pocket, the last little bit of finances to feed this beast, and the side that can put the last 500,000 men in uniform. So these guys get it. So that draws the question then, if you're fighting an attritional war where both sides are being eroded, where do you hit that tipping point? Where do you hit that tipping point where the balance of attrition starts to go inevitably in the side of one and the tide of defeat runs against the other? Tonight I'm going to argue, hopefully without too many historian tricks, that World War I is unusual because it doesn't reach its turning point to the last 3 months of the war. Specifically, it's not till August of 1918 that attritional tipping point has decisively turned on the side of the Ally. And to avoid Monday morning quarterback, I try to make this argument based upon the perceptions of the people at the time. So by August of 1918, I will argue that the Allied military and political leaders have understood that something has dramatically changed, and they have the possibility of ending the war before the end of the year. Conversely, by August of 1918, the German political and military leadership has realized that they no longer have the last dollar in their wallet and the last 500,000 men to throw into the battlefield. But before we get to August of 1918, we've got to go back and set a little bit of context here. Now, 1917 is a horrible year for the Allies. It is the worst year for the Allies the entire war, with every major Allied army on every major Allied front suffering catastrophic losses and defeats. Worse yet, when it comes to the Allied war effort, devastating things start to happen on the Eastern Front, perhaps the most important for tonight's story. In March of 1918, the Russians undergo their first revolution. The Tsar abdicates, and he's replaced by a provincial government which will ultimately be led by Alexander Kerensky. Now, Kerensky's goal is to remain in the war, supporting the Allies. But as 1917 continues to spool on, the Russian soldiers and the Russian civilians are getting fed up with the war itself. Ultimately, in November of 1917, this will lead to the Second Russian Revolution. This time, the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Ilyich Lenin will seize power and fundamentally start to change the strategic direction of the war. So if you're the Germans reading the tea leaves, things seem to be going your way. But you can always count on the Germans, thank God, in the 20th century to make massive strategic blunders. Thank God for it, okay? Their massive strategic blunder is in January of 1917, they resume unrestricted submarine warfare. Now, under American pressure, they had stopped doing unrestricted submarine warfare in 1915 after the Lusitania and a few other atrocities. But by 1917, they're feeling the bite of this war, and they start to realize that their hope of winning is perhaps to use their submarines to starve the British into submission. But they know if they resume unrestricted submarine warfare, there is a better than average chance that the United States is going to come into the war. So to hedge their bets, they'll make another strategic blunder. Arthur Zimmermann, the German foreign minister, will send a telegram to his ambassador in Mexico City, offering the Mexicans a deal. The argument is, if the United States comes into the war, all the Germans want is for Mexico to attack the United States, thus keeping us locked into the Western Hemisphere. In return, when Germany wins, the Mexicans will regain all the lands they lost to the Americans in the Mexican-American War. What could possibly go wrong? Except for, of course, the British intercepting that information and happily giving it to the United States. And so on the 6th of August, 1917, the United States enters World War I. Now, the two men who are actually leading Germany. On the left here is Paul von Hindenburg, but really the driving force is the man on the right, Erich Ludendorff. Now, Ludendorff knows that with the turmoil going on in Russia, with the blunders that the Allies have made in 1917, he might have a window of opportunity to put Germany on the path of victory. And so on the 11th of November 1917, interestingly, 1 year before the end of the war, he gets all his senior commanders together at Mons, Belgium, and starts planning for the victory campaigns. But against this backdrop of planning for victory, there's also this looming. The German Navy had promised that no American troops were going to set foot in France because their U-boats were going to sink them all. That failed. And the specter that is confronting Ludendorff is the fact that up to 4 million fresh, young American soldiers might soon be landing on the shores of France. And if that happens, those attritional balances of manpower are going to decisively shift towards the Allies. So if you're Ludendorff, the clock is ticking. There's other reasons why the clock is ticking. In November of 1914, the British Navy begins a blockade of Germany. Nothing comes in, nothing goes out. That includes food. And this was a deliberate British policy to try to bring the Germans to heel through starvation. And it's working. The winter of 1917-1918 in Germany is known as the turnip winter because that's all that most people have to eat in vast swaths of the nation. And just to give you an idea of the calorie content, if you are living in a German city, for the most part you are surviving in 1917 and 1918 on 1,000 calories a day. That's less than a Big Mac meal, okay? Not supersized. So what else is worrying Ludendorff is the possibility that the home front might crack, that you can't keep going to the well to the German people asking for more. His ray of sunshine, though, comes with these two guys. When the Bolsheviks seize power in November of 1917, they're automatically going to go into a civil war against the monarchists and other white forces, trying to keep them from consolidating their hold on power. And what Lenin and Trotsky are promising the Russian people are peace, land, and bread. Now, doesn't that sound nice? Peace, land, and bread. The problem is, there is no peace. You're still at war with Germany. You don't have the land to give because you don't control it. And you sure as heck don't have any bread. So if you're going to have Bolshevism take root in Russia, you're going to have to fundamentally change the dynamics. You're going to have to end the war. And so they go hat in hand to the Germans. Will you please let us end the war? Now the Germans, of course, are happy to oblige. But the Germans are going to do what is known as a Carthaginian peace. We're going to give you peace, but you're going to pay for it. And so as a condition of allowing the Russians, the Bolsheviks, to leave the war, the Germans are going to grab, well, most of what is today the Ukraine. Imagine that. Now, by doing this, the Germans hope to get two major things out of it. The central dilemma of German military history, going back to Frederick the Great or earlier, is that they live in a crack house neighborhood, right? They're always facing multiple fronts. With Russia out of the war, they are now only fighting a one-front war. And now, in theory, they can take all of those soldiers they have on the Eastern Front and divert them to the Western Front to crush the Allies before the Americans come into the war in large numbers. The other thing they hope to get out of it is plunder, plunder, plunder. That as they plunder the Ukraine of all their agricultural resources, they hope to stave off starvation in Germany. There's a catch. Funny thing about these Ukrainians, they don't like people to take their land, and they don't like people to take their stuff. Good things that things never change. And so while they hope to move these troops, they can only ultimately move 36 divisions. They have to keep 1 million Germans in the Ukraine to fight a counter-partisan war. But that's still a lot more forces that they can move. Now, Ludendorff has to figure out the path to victory. And after that initial planning conference, he then holds a larger conference in Arsens in January of 1918 to plot the land forward. Now, interesting thing about Ludendorff, now he's turning into a small thinker. There are 3 levels of war. Tactical level, guys fighting with rifles at close range. Operational level, putting armies together. And ultimately the strategic level. When he is considering how to get victory, he is fixated on the tactical level. Now there's a good reason for that. That ultimately, until you break through the trenches, break through the stalemate on the Western Front, operations and strategy is of a lesser importance. The downside is while focusing exclusively on the tactical level, even if you are successful, if you don't have any plan to turn that tactical success into operational success and then strategic success, ultimately it doesn't matter. So he's putting everything he can into low-level tactical responses to strategic dilemmas. 2 things are working here. One is he's going to change the artillery of the German army. The Germans cannot match the Allies artillery piece to artillery piece, shell to shell. So they're going to have to figure out a new tactic to get the most bang out of their limited buck. The guy who figures it out is George Buckmiller. I cannot destroy wide swaths of the Allied forces, but what I can use is use these hurricane bombardments, short, intense bombardments of gas and high explosive, to neutralize those things that give the Allies power, like their own artillery and their command post. And once those things are neutralized, then these elite troops, storm troops, highly trained, extremely heavily armed infantry guys, will use new tactics. If I'm going to do those big wave tactics that you often see in the movie, these stormtroopers are little groups of paratroops, as we call it today. They move forward and find the weaknesses in the line, infiltrate behind it, and once they get behind the Allied lines, they take out the Allied strong points, take out the command posts, take out the artillery. And what Ludendorff is hoping to get out of this is to hack a hole, as he said, and let the rest follow. The only question is, where are you going to hit with time running out? And they look at all these different possibilities, and it's almost like the three bears. Well, this sector is too wet. Well, this sector is too shelled. Ultimately, they go with the Somme, this sector right here. Now, this is important because where they're going to launch this attack, called Operation Michael, is what we call the hinge, the seam between units. So on one hand, on the southern side of that, you've got the French army, and north of that, you've got the British army. And whenever you have forces like that, different nationalities, different command structures, there's always that lack of coverage right there in the seam. But when he hits there, the ultimate goal of this operation is to drive a hole deep into the Allied lines, then turn to the north. This has nothing to do with Paris, unlike what a lot of historians say. There is no intent to go with Paris. Paris is one of the most heavily defended places in the world at this time. The only way you're going to change the dynamic of this war and give Germany a hope of victory is to knock one of the countries out of the war. And Ludendorff rightly says the only way I can do that is I push here, I go north, separating the Allied armies, that if I threaten this, the French will pull back to defend Paris, the British will pull back to defend their channel ports. We will then encircle the British and either destroy them or force them off the continent. Either way works. If I can force the British off the continent or destroy the British Expeditionary Force, the French will be left on their own. The best laid plans of mice and men do often go astray. When they launch Operation Michael on the 21st of March 1918, it is an outstanding success. They blow a big hole through the Allied lines and continue to drive 70 kilometers. Just to give you just some perspective of how rapid this advance is going. By the time it peters out, 15 days later on the 6th of April, they've gone 70 kilometers. D plus 15 at Normandy in 1944 only nets 25 kilometers with all the tanks and all the airplanes and all the naval support. So this is actually a pretty impressive operation. But like all of these operations, they have a tether, and that tends to be logistics. And even though they're victorious at the tactical level, they've lost a lot of soldiers making this breakthrough. And so finally, by the 6th of April, this offensive has petered out. And again, without any operational plan of what to do next, now Ludendorff has to go back and figure out the next step. The next step will be Operation Georgette. He's now trying to hit closer to the Allied ports, or to the British ports. You'll notice Dunkirk at the top. In many ways, what Ludendorff is trying to do in the spring of 1918 is what the Germans are trying to do in France in June of 1940. Same idea, cut here, go north, push the British off. But you'll notice in this offensive, which goes on even longer, they don't go nearly as far. The British and the French are starting to figure out the shtick that the Germans are using. Now, that's not to say that this does not come without a lot of confusion in the Allied ranks. If you can imagine, after years of stagnation, going back to 1914, to all of a sudden have the Germans knock a 70-kilometer deep hole in your lines, there's a lot of conniption going on in the Allied lines. And everybody's trying to figure out what to do next. The Allies lose a lot of soldiers there, 255,000 men killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. But we also got to keep in mind, though, that while this disaster is unfolding on the Somme, those transports carrying those fresh, young Americans are starting to land. And in March and April of 1918 alone, the Americans are going to land with numbers that almost overcome whatever losses that they had suffered to the Germans. Now, what ultimately comes out of all of this friction in the Allied ranks is to do what they hadn't been able to do since 1914. Since 1914, on all the fronts, the Russians would do their thing, the British would do their thing, the French would do their thing, the Italians would do their thing, all left to their own devices. And the crisis of March and April of 1918, finally, the Allies come kicking and screaming to a unified command. And if there is a hero of the Allied side in 1918, it's this man, Ferdinand Foch. And the reason that he becomes the hero is that he believes, more than anybody else, 15 minutes longer than the enemy, that he can win. He has optimism in this time of despair, and the guy who figures this out first is Georges Clemenceau. He sees Foch as the only one of the senior commanders who have not only kept their cool here, but are actually talking about what they've got to do to turn around the situation. And he has made what in World War II we consider to be the supreme Allied commander. Now everybody else reports to Foch. Now the first thing that's going to come out of Foch and the Supreme Allied War Council in March and April of 1918 is to try to stabilize the situation on the front. So the first thing you got to do is a joint British and French defense of the key rail hub of Amiens. If you lose Amiens, it makes it difficult to move troops and supplies all along the front. So if you hold that, you can hold against future German assaults. The next thing you got to do is ensure that the skittishness of the British particularly has been allayed. And now you can get a steady Allied line all along the front. The controversial thing is the last one. Coming out of the conferences at Doullens and Beauvais, the Allied High Command is saying, we need to amalgamate the American forces. And what this means is you're going to take American regiments, American battalions, and even American companies, split them up amongst Allied units under Allied command. So the Americans will not be fighting under American flag, they'll be fighting under British or French flags. They go a little step further. While John J. Pershing, the commander of the American Expeditionary Force, ultimately wants to establish an independent American army with its own sector of the front, the Allies insist that until the crisis is over, that the Americans only ship infantrymen and machine gunners. That means it'll be impossible then to put together all the support troops, all the artillery, everything else you'll need in divisions and corps for an independent army. Now, as you can imagine, John J. Pershing has a mite bit of problem with this argument. Okay? And while at the break point in March of 1918, when things seem to be going to hell in a handbasket, he goes to Foch and offers everything the Americans have. Once he starts to hear this amalgamation idea, he starts to oppose Foch, push back, work around him with the Allied High Command, with the British High Command, to overturn some of these decisions. But while all this wrangling is going on, the Germans are trying to retain the initiative. And so the first two offensives have ground to a halt, far short of achieving their strategic goal. If at first you don't succeed, try again. So finally in late May, the Germans will strike again. It was what is known as Operation Blooker. This time they're going to go across the Chemin des Dames Ridge, scene of the fighting in 1917, push and capture Soissons and drive towards Chateau Thierry. Now again, contrary to popular belief, their goal is not to drive on Paris. What their goal is to threaten Paris, to again sow confusion in the Allied ranks. And what Ludendorff hopes will happen in the midst of this confusion is that the French and the British will pull their reserves to contain this big attack, thus leaving the British vulnerable again in Flanders. Now, largely due to mistakes of the French commander, Denis Duchesne, this is a phenomenal success. In fact, in the first day of this offensive, the Germans advanced further than any other day in World War I history. And they are pressing the French hard. But just like it happened in the other offensives, by the time you are driving 56 miles, you have run out of steam. The soldiers are exhausted, you've outrun your supplies, and the Germans now come to a halt. Now you have a problem. You have taken a lot of Allied territory, but what you've created is a big salient, a big bulge in the Allied lines. Now, it is a truism of military tactics that when you are deep in the enemy's rear, the enemy is deep in yours. The Germans are trying to figure out what to do because, again, even though they've taken all this, the Allies didn't take the bait, did not switch all of their reserves to this location. So any follow-up operations are almost all for naught. This is a very vulnerable place. They've cut some of the rail lines, but you'll notice there are no rail lines going into the salient itself. On Ludendorff's last try to win this war, he will push, if you see where the map is here, it runs here to try to expand the Bulge. This is the objective line they were going for. The little red line is how far they get. Ferdinand Foch has been watching. He said, except for this anomaly here where my own guy sort of screwed up, every one of these subsequent German attacks have been less powerful, have gone less deep, and have cost them a lot more casualties. So Foch is the one that's figuring out, maybe now we can change the dynamic of this war. Maybe now that attritional balance scale is sliding in our side. Now there's some other important things that the Allies have figured out by this part of the war too. It's what today we call combined arms warfare. And to some extent, this is the stuff that the U.S. Army has been doing for the last 100 years, and also what the Ukrainians are trying to get going in their war with the Russians today. Combined arms warfare is to take all of these modern terrors and put them together. You're going to have artillery, the big killer of the battlefield. It's going to pave the way for the infantry. As Pétain says, artillery conquers, infantry occupies. But as the infantry goes forward now, they're going to be closely supported by waves of tanks and overhead air power. The Allies can do this. They have the industrial capacity to put all of this stuff together, and the Germans simply do not. And from this point to the end of the war, the Allies are going to be using combined arms warfare against the Germans, an operational approach that the Germans cannot match. And the first test case is going to be in the Unmarred, starting on the 18th of July. The idea behind it is a massive attack using forces from all of the major combatants of the war. In fact, American forces will be nearly 25% of the forces here. You see 8 American divisions, but every American division is twice the size of a British or a French division. The idea is to cut this salient off at the throat. Think about closing the neck of the top of a sack, cutting the German supply routes that they have going through here, and bagging a bunch of Germans before that they can withdraw. So you're going to be killing, you're going to be capturing a lot of Germans. You're going to be increasing that attrition. And while it is bloody when it starts off, when it starts rolling, this is a brilliant assault. To the point that by the time you get to the 27th of July, The French commander, General Fayot, taking direction directly from Foch, is saying, this is what it is. This is our moment. We've got the scare up. We've got to keep it up. The Germans are collapsing. We're taking tens of thousands of prisoners. I don't care how tired you are. I don't care how sick you are. I don't care how hungry you are. Everybody fight. This is the end result. Now, traditionally in warfare, the attacker suffers 2 or more times the losses of the defender. That's not what's happening here. Since the Germans can't match this combined arms warfare, the German defenders are actually suffering a lot more casualties, well, enough casualties compared to the Allies. You're also starting to bag a lot more German prisoners of war. If you're starting to bag a lot of prisoners of war, that's telling you that there's an issue with morale on the other side of the line. I can hear the guns now, okay? What also happens, though, is by the 19th of July, Ludendorff is starting to lose it. He's on the verge of a nervous breakdown. In fact, on the 19th of July, he will publicly rebuke his superior, Hindenburg, and thus end this great professional marriage that's been going on since the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914. And from that point on, he's no longer really able to control what's happening on the battlefront. Now, I told you I was going to try to avoid Monday morning quarterbacking. This is how I'm going to do it. We're going to see that from the lowest level to the highest level, people are starting to realize that something has fundamentally changed on the Western Front. You see it here with this German officer, this lieutenant. And you can feel in this quote in his diary the angst that he's starting to feel. We have been victorious. We have been driving the Allies back since March. And we did this huge penetration at Soissons. And we had the French in full retreat. And yet, they stopped us. And not only did they stop us, without us being able to catch on to it, they caught us by surprise with our pants down and were able to then launch a major counterattack and drive us back. On the Allied side, you also start to feel the changing atmosphere. Here is a lowly Marine private, Gerald Clark, who participates in this battle of Soissons, and he writes back to his family a glowing letter that says, look, this Foch guy has got it. Now, today we'll never praise generals. I'm just telling you, it just doesn't happen. This Foch guy has got it, and I love this last line. Sometimes I think it will all end this fall. That stuff is catching. And if the guys at the lowest level are starting to think that, you can probably guarantee the guys at top are starting to think it too. Foch is the first guy who's starting to see, maybe, this has turned. Maybe, we have got the initiative in this war. He will meet with the commanders on the 24th of July to say, we are going to get ready for a massive assault. Now, when they do this, he's very conservative at the beginning. He believes that, look, what we'll do for the remainder of the year is grab some key railroads from the Germans to open up our supply lines. We'll bring in all those fresh young Americans, and we'll be in a position to resume the war, resume the offensive, and win the war in 1919. But he's telling guys, whenever you can, whenever you have the opportunity, go on the offensive. The British believe him. 2 days after the end of the Soissons campaign, the British will launch an all-out combined arms attack at Amiens. Ludendorff will later call this the Black Day of the German Army because it tears the heart out of the defenses. It recaptures all that territory that the Allies had lost from the Germans at Operation Michael, and you start to again see more Germans are being lost than Allies are being lost, even though the Allies are on the attack. And more Germans are going off to captivity. Now, between the Battle of Unmarred, Soissons, and Amiens, the other side's starting to catch on too. Now, let's be honest. The Kaiser's not necessarily been Johnny on the spot when it came to understanding this war. But even the Kaiser, by the time you get to the Battle of Amiens, has figured out, hey, I hate to tell you guys, we're down to our last dollar and down to our last 500,000 guys. We got to end this war. It's only a matter of time. Foch again is the man of the hour. In the wake of Amiens and Unmarred, he now believes that he can win the war before the end of the year. Not going into 1919 or 1920, as the pessimists say. We will end it before Christmas. And all I got to get you guys to do is to all pull together. So he's going to change his plan. We're not going to go after railroads. We're not going to go after getting in a better position. We're going to go for all the marbles. And as Supreme Allied Commander, his new plan is to have every army all along the Western Front to attack all together. The idea behind it is a big pincer movement. You'll have a pincer coming in from the south, a pincer coming in from the north. You will encircle and destroy the German army in detail, liberating the occupied territories of France and Belgium and defeating Germany, kicking it out of the war. Now, we've got a few more minutes, so I'll hurry. The one guy who has some problems with this is our old friend John J. Pershing. Now, Pershing still liked the old idea because since roughly beginning of 1918, he had been planning for an attack in this direction, towards Metz. Get rid of the Saint-Mihiel salient, push towards Metz. And Foch had initially given him the thumbs up. Yeah, go ahead, John, knock yourself out. Here's your independent army. But he shows up at Pershing's headquarters on the 30th of August and says, hey, John, got a new plan for you. Scrap that Saint-Mihiel. I know you're planning for it. I know it's supposed to happen in 2 weeks. I don't want you to do it anymore. It's not going in the direction that I want. Pershing is not willing to give this up. And it becomes heated to the point that a point in time in this argument, Pershing says, I considered punching Foch in the mouth. Now, who hasn't wanted to punch their boss in the mouth? I'm just saying. Now, it's probably good for the Allies that they didn't do it. At the end, both of these guys need each other. So they have to compromise. Kicking and screaming, Foch allows Pershing to execute the Saint-Mihiel operation, the AEF's coming out party. But he insists that I don't care what you're doing, I don't care how this operation is going, by the 26th of September, you end it, and you're doing your major attack in the Meuse-Argonne, supporting my operation. Now, Pershing wanted this to go well, so he took all of his best, most experienced divisions and put them towards Saint-Mihiel. The problem, though, was that meant that those best trained divisions, most experienced divisions, weren't ready for the main effort at Meuse-Argonne. Now, this goes swimmingly for the Americans, fortunately. The next phase, not so much. The Meuse-Argonne has the dubious distinction of being the largest campaign in American history and the bloodiest campaign in American history. It is a hard place to crack even with the most experienced troops, and the Americans weren't experienced. Even then, though, the AEF is doing damage to the Germans, holding down at least 24% of the German army on the Western Front. At the end of the day, why did the Americans suffer 26,000 dead? An attritional war? Because they can. And the Germans can't. And while the Americans are struggling through the Meuse-Argonne, the British are also putting the accelerator on with their operations. They'll be launching what is later known as the 100 Days Campaign. From Amiens to the armistice, the German army is constantly moving forward, constantly grinding down German units. In the end, look at that. Nearly 190,000 prisoners. That's telling you that the German military morale is cracking. But attritional war carries its own rules. Look at the British casualties. Okay? The bloodiest campaign in British military history was the Battle of the Somme. In fact, the bloodiest day in British military history is the first day of the Battle of the Somme, 1 July 1916. And while the British are finally pushed the Germans out into the open, this ugly war, ugly attritional war, means even when you're on open warfare, you're still taking casualties. So arguably the British are losing as many men in the open against a defeated German army as they had in the Somme in 1916. Why do the British suffer these casualties? Ultimately because they can. The Germans can't. Some might argue that the true turning point of attritional war is when the other side finally cries uncle. And that occurs on the 11th of November, 1918. Thank you very much for your attention. What are your questions?
Thank you, Dr. Faulkner. We'll take questions now. If you have a question, please step up to the microphone here so our friends at home can hear you. And I may interrupt to read some questions that people have written on YouTube. Make sure when you ask your question that it's something that ends in a question mark.
Fair enough. Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here. That was great. I thought the whole time while you were speaking, if the Germans had won the war, what would they have asked of the Allies?
Well, okay, so I got to tell you the standard historian thing, right? We don't do alternate history. You know, if Eleanor Roosevelt would have had wings, would she have been B-17? Okay, but
Phrased a different way, why did they start the war to begin with? What was their initial objective?
well, you know, that's another 3-hour debate. But I will tell you this. I will give you this. The Germans are ham-handed in their approach to a lot of things in the 20th century. When they do the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, this Carthaginian peace that they've imposed upon the Russians, they actually give the Allies an advantage. Because when they do that Carthaginian peace, now Georges Clemenceau and David Lloyd George and Woodrow Wilson can go to their people and say, see what's going to happen if you lose. If you lose, they're going to do a Carthaginian peace on you. And I think that's sort of the Germans, if they win this, they're going to habeas grab some stuff. They're going to take big parts of Belgium. They've already said it. Take Luxembourg, already said it. More annexations in France, not to mention their, proto-Lebensraum in Russia. So if they lose, they've promised their people that the other side's going to pay, just like they made the French pay after the Franco-Prussian War. And so everybody knows that. And so when the Germans whine about what they get at Versailles, I'm not as sympathetic. Okay? That they ultimately, sort of reap what they sowed.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I know military historians don't like to discuss domestic stuff, but my question is, if you have, what's the word, high casualty wars, what was there a difference in what the casualties that the American people would take and accept, and the Germans and the French and the British? Because if you're going to have, and the word gets out of my brain here, if you're going to have that kind of a war,
yes,
the people back home have to tolerate the casualties.
Absolutely.
26,000 dead.
Yes.
People say, well, no, I don't think so. So my question is, was there a difference in what the casualties that the folks back home are willing to tolerate?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually we'll tie back to what I sidestepped with you. That in 1914, the only nation that absolutely has to go to war is Austria-Hungary. That if, based on the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Austria-Hungary is a polyglot empire of all different types of peoples, all different types of religion, and what they fear more than anything else is the spread of nationalism. So if they let Serbian nationalism go rampant, Humpty Dumpty falls apart. So they're the only country that has to go to war. The alliance system then brings everybody else in. But what starts out as not existential for all the other combatants quickly turns existential. And it sort of becomes that sunk cost fallacy that you reach a point in every war, and especially these big attritional total wars, where you have sacrificed so much blood, sweat, toil, and tears, you can't go back. So at the end of 1914, when it's clear to you you have no path to victory for any side, if you go, hey, let's just go back to status quo ante bellum, we'll go back to our respective sides, every political leader knows if they do that, they'll be lynched from the nearest light pole. So you've got to promise your people that Carthaginian peace. When we win, we're going to make those other side pay. We're going to cover up your losses by making the other side pay. That now, once you start to get in this belief that this is existential, that if you lose it all, it becomes a lot easier now to go back to your people and say, I need a little bit more. And so when it comes to how much is enough, that is generally not a question that's being asked in World War I. And I'll give you a little highlight here. And this is a question of, are democracies or autocracies strongest when it comes to total war? All of the sides by 1918 are having labor troubles. Again, inflation is going through the roof. It's hard to live. Prices are skyrocketing for food. And so people are striking. And in Germany, they have a solution to that. When the German munition workers strike, Ludendorff conscripts them into the army. Okay? Now, I want you to think about this. Take some people who are already sort of pissed off and put them in uniform and send them to the front. What could possibly go wrong? The other side is what David Lloyd George does. In the midst of these German offenses, when things are looking very grim, he's also trying to do a comb out of the coal workers. He needs manpower. Everybody needs manpower. And when he threatens to, again, comb out some of the younger workers out of the mines, the coal workers threaten to go on strike. What he does is different. He invites all of the strike leaders, the union leaders, to number 10 Downing Street and shows him the secret map of the war, showing how poorly things are going. And by taking those guys into his confidence, they go back to their constituents and say, shut up, back in the mine, you young lot, welcome to the recruiter. So that's what it takes to sort of fight this. Excellent question. Yes, sir.
So I was struck by this initial massive German advance that apparently the Allies were completely caught unawares. And I'm thinking there must have been either a massive lack of intelligence or intelligence didn't even exist as a concept. And then how did that affect the rest of the war?
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, the Allies know what's coming.
They did.
Oh, yeah. They know that a massive German assault is going to come. They can read the tea leaves, too. They understand the Russians are collapsing. They understand that the Germans are going to have this free manpower. So in the winter and spring of 1918, they're anticipating an assault. The question is where? What compounds this is the British do not properly understand how to defend against one of these major assaults. The Allies have been on the assault, on the attack since 1914. And so they try to copy some of the German defensive tactics that had come out in 1917. They do it poorly. And so with flawed tactics, lack of frontline strength, because again, they've suffered a lot of attrition, the Germans just hit the right place at the right time against the right commander who hasn't implemented the right tactical defensive doctrine, and it overwhelms them. And again, the same thing sort of happens at Duchesne at Unmarred, at Soissons, that Pétain says, do not put your troops in the front line. They will be overrun. They'll be crushed by this hurricane bombardment. Do a defense in depth, like the Germans have done. And when Duchesne doesn't listen to him, it's really more of their fault than necessarily the German strength. But excellent question. Thank you.
And we have a quick question from home.
Yes, ma'am.
Somebody watching on their computer would like to know what this painting is.
Okay. This is the Germans begging for an armistice at the Forest of Campagne on the 11th of November 1918, which will lead to the armistice that ends the war.
You happen to know who painted it?
I do not, unfortunately.
All right, thank
But the
you.
guy in the middle, of course, is Ferdinand Foch, our hero.
Thank you. I'm sorry, sir. Go ahead.
No problem. Thank you very much for your presentation. Another wonderful job. I always
thank you.
appreciate listening to you. In the beginning of your presentation, you talked about two German mistakes in 1917, renewal of unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram.
That's correct.
It amazes me that the Germans would have asked Mexico, considering Mexico was in a revolution and civil war for the last 7 years. I mean, why would they even think that was a good idea?
What's John J. Pershing's last assignment before taking over the AEO?
Oh, exactly. Didn't work out too well.
Yeah, so I mean, there had already been tensions. We'd already come to the brink of war with the Carranza government, and then Pancho Villa, of course. And so the Germans say, hey, look, the tensions are already there. All we need the Mexicans to do is to commit. And again, this is a sterling mistake of understanding on the part of the Germans. There's no way that Carranza is going to do that.
No. He was
Yeah.
devastated by all the Civil War. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
We've got
Any thoughts on how the Russian-Ukrainian war might end in light of what you've said tonight?
Well, yeah, in a couple of years, maybe we'll do the turning point of the Ukraine war, which sort of shows us the problem with, in the midst of the war, trying to put your finger on what's a turning point. I will tell you, the Ukrainians sure as hell hope the turning point is now. And I hope it is for them. But the problem with turning points is just because you want it to be a turning point doesn't mean it's going to be the turning point that you anticipate. Sadly, if this offensive doesn't play out, then all those other realities of attritional war start to come home to roost in Kyiv. And it becomes, I think, harder for them to maintain the passion for the war. I hope the Ukrainians have the best. But I will tell you honestly, as a guy who tries to read on this every day, I think the only people that really understand what's going on in the Ukraine are the Ukrainian and the Russians. The rest of us are sort of guessing and hoping for the best. If they can get through the minefields, let's face it, the only way that they're going to the Ukrainians fundamentally change the strategic direction of that war is either to retake a lot of land or to kill and capture a lot of Russians. And I hope for them the best in both of those, I'll be honest with you. I'm an old Cold Warrior. I just think it's going to be harder to do than we hope. So, yeah.
And these will be our last two questions. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, sir.
Thanks again. You talked about the mistakes the Germans made. If they hadn't made so many mistakes, do you think they would have ever had a chance to prevail in this war?
It was, well, again, I make an argument. I studied the American Army in World War I, and I make an argument that irritates all my European comrades, that the Americans win the war just by showing up, right? For two reasons. First of all, this fear of 4 million fresh young Americans is what really pushes Ludendorff into this precipitous series of attacks. And his own failing to sort of say, hey, operationally, what are we trying to accomplish and what's the best path to get there, means that you see him jumping constantly, one operation to the next operation. And every time he's doing that, he is wasting again Germany's limited manpower resources. So did the Germans ever have a path to victory? That's a hard one to say. And by the time you get to late 1917, the problem is the political realities have changed. That in Britain under David Lloyd George, and France under Clemenceau, and Germany under Ludendorff, you've got the bitter enders. Any hope of negotiated peace, and there never was much of one after 1915 to start off with, any hope of a negotiated peace is gone. The only way you're going to end this is in the abject defeat of one side or the other. And whatever tenuous hope that the Germans had of emerging with anything that smelled a little bit like victory, they quickly dissipate through all these series of advances. So I hope that answered your question.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Well, my question's kind of strange. Woodrow Wilson had a whole bunch of strokes back then.
Yes, he did.
And his wife was pretty much running everything. and we got women's suffrage. And to me, can you say something about the League of Nations, and was that really Woodrow or his wife?
Well, that's Woodrow Wilson. His strokes actually occur after the armistice. In fact, a lot of the strokes come from him campaigning vigorously to try to get this League of Nations going. Now, he came up with his 14 points. And originally there are elements inside Germany that say, hey, this actually sounds like a relatively good deal. Though with Ludendorff and the Kaiser, it was never going to come to fruition. But if you look at the 14 points, it is both idealistic, trying to make a better world, but it's also self-serving for us. If you look at the 14 points, it was going to make the world better for, I don't know, America. And who can argue with that, right? When it comes to his thing that he wants to die on the hill on, it's the League of Nations, collective security, a proto-UN. And the argument is if we can get all the major players in the world together, we can debate away the problems, that we can make war a thing of the past. Now, there's going to be problems on two areas. One is, of course, from the French and the British. Hey, they've suffered a lot here. They don't want nice and easy, let's kiss and make up. They want to hammer the Germans a little bit, deservedly so. The other, of course, comes from the United States itself, that throughout the majority of our history, we kept away from entangling alliances, especially in Europe. Decrepit, old, corrupt Europe. And what a lot of Americans fear, especially the Republicans, like Henry Cabot Lodge, is that old Woody and his crazy liberal ideas was going to commit the United States military and government to these internecine wars that the European powers were going to fight over colonialism and everything else. So ultimately, of course, American opposition in the Senate makes sure that the League of Nations is dead. And it was always going to have some problems struggling towards the light, but with the United States definitely keeping out of it, it was on life support from the minute it was born. So good question. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you.